I never told my husband that I earn $60,000 a month. He filed for divorce. I am tired of supporting you. You are a burden in my life. I nodded. 2 months later, he came to beg for a job at my company. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I had the perfect life. Looking back now, I realize I had a perfect performance of a life. Carefully staged, lit just right, and utterly hollow beneath the surface. My name is Claire Hendricks. I'm 38 years old, and for 11 years, I was married to Derek Calloway. We lived in a 4-bedroom house in Naperville, Illinois, the kind of neighborhood where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and wave at each other from driveways. We had a golden retriever named Biscuit, a shared Netflix password, and a dinner routine that almost never changed. Pasta on Tuesdays, takeout on Fridays. From the outside, we looked like an average, comfortable American couple. What nobody knew, not Derek, not his mother Patricia, not our neighbors, was that I was earning $60,000 a month. I hadn't always been successful. When Derek and I married, I was a junior marketing consultant making $42,000 a year. He was a regional sales manager at a manufacturing company, pulling in about $80,000. He liked that dynamic. He never said so directly, but I could feel it. The way he'd pick up the check at restaurants with a certain satisfied exhale. The way he'd say, "I'll handle it," whenever something needed to be paid. He was the provider. I was the partner who contributed a little. That identity mattered to him more than he ever admitted. The problem was I kept growing, quietly, methodically. 7 years ago, I launched a digital consulting firm on the side. I worked on it during lunch breaks after Derek fell asleep on Saturday mornings when he was watching football. It started with 1 client, then 3, then a full roster. I incorporated formally 4 years ago. Within 2 years, I had 6 employees and contracts with mid-size companies across the Midwest. My monthly income crossed $60,000 18 months ago and had been climbing steadily since. I never told Derek. That probably sounds strange, maybe even cruel. But let me explain the arithmetic of it. Early on, I kept it quiet because it was small. I didn't want to jinx it. Then it grew, and I saw what happened when I mentioned my work at dinner parties. Derek would go quiet, tight-jawed. He'd steer the conversation elsewhere, or worse, he'd make a joke. "She's always working on her little project." The word "little" landed like a pin. I noticed. I said nothing, so I kept separate accounts. My business revenue went to a business account I'd opened before we married. I drew a modest personal salary, about $4,500 a month, that went into our joint account. Derek assumed that was my total income. He never asked for documentation. Why would he? He already knew the answer, or thought he did. The first real warning sign came 14 months before the divorce. Derek had been passed over for a promotion at work. His company had brought in a younger director from outside, and Derek had taken it hard. He started coming home later, drinking more. Not dramatically, just an extra bourbon after dinner, then 2, then the bottle living on the counter instead of the cabinet. I noticed but didn't push. I understood wounded pride. What I didn't expect was where he redirected it. "You're lucky you have me," he said one evening in March, out of nowhere. We were watching television. He didn't look at me when he said it. I turned. "What?" "I'm just saying. You'd really struggle on your own. It's good that one of us is stable." I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I sat with that sentence the way you sit with a splinter, aware of it, unable to stop pressing on it. Over the following weeks, the comments multiplied. Small things, but pointed. He started managing our grocery trips as though I couldn't be trusted with the budget. He'd reference my income almost apologetically when talking to friends. Claire does her consulting thing. It's not big money, but she enjoys it. He began signing documents for the house, the car insurance, things we'd always handled jointly, as though I'd already stepped back from full partnership. And then came the evening everything crystallized. It was a Wednesday. I remember because I'd just finished a call with a client in Dallas, a contract renewal worth $240,000 annually. I was still at my home office desk, quietly pleased, when Derek appeared in the doorway. He had the look on his face I'd come to recognize. Flat. Decided. I want a divorce, Claire. I set my phone down. I'm done, he said. I'm tired of carrying this household. I'm tired of carrying you. You're a burden in my life, and I think we both know it. I looked at him for a long moment, and then I nodded. Not because I agreed, not because I was broken. I nodded because something cold and clear moved through me, the kind of clarity that only arrives when a person finally shows you exactly who they are. Derek didn't see a partner when he looked at me. He saw a dependent, a passenger, someone who owed him gratitude for the ride. He mistook my silence for surrender. That was his first mistake. The days immediately following Derek's announcement were quieter than I expected. He moved into the guest room without drama. We exchanged necessary words. There's coffee, and Biscuit needs his walk, and otherwise treated each other like strangers sharing a terminal at an airport. Polite, efficient, empty. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I'd expected grief to arrive like a wave, but instead it came in smaller, stranger forms. I stood in front of the refrigerator one morning for 3 full minutes, unable to remember what I'd opened it for. I drove to the grocery store and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes without going in. My body was processing something my mind was refusing to fully name. What I felt most, underneath the numbness, was fear. Not the fear of being alone. I'd been emotionally alone in this marriage for longer than I wanted to admit. It was a more specific fear, the fear of exposure. Because if Derek filed for divorce, things would surface. Financial documents, depositions, discovery processes. Illinois is an equitable distribution state, and 11 years of marriage meant Derek would have a reasonable claim to a significant portion of marital assets. My business, depending on how a court evaluated its growth during the marriage, could be classified as a marital asset. I sat at my desk late one night after Derek had gone to sleep, and I ran the numbers. The business had been incorporated after our marriage. I had kept meticulous records, and the initial capital had come from an inheritance left to me by my grandmother, clearly separate property. But the growth, the contracts, the value accrued over 6 years of marriage, that was murkier. I wasn't panicking, but I was not naive. I needed a lawyer, a good one, immediately. I called Margaret Osee the next morning. Margaret was a family law attorney I'd met through a client referral 2 years earlier. She was 51, calm, and had the particular manner of someone who had heard every variation of every story and remained unimpressed by all of them. I liked her immediately. She did not waste words. I told her everything in her Michigan Avenue office. Derek's announcement, the marriage timeline, the business structure, the separate accounts. She listened with her hands folded and asked 3 precise questions. When was the business incorporated? Were joint funds ever deposited into the business accounts? Did Derek ever directly contribute to the business in any documented way? The answers were, during the marriage, never. No. Margaret nodded slowly. Your inheritance as startup capital is protected as separate property. The retained business earnings are more complex, but with your records, we have a strong argument. The key is that you move thoughtfully. Don't tip your hand. Let him file first if he's going to. He said he wanted the divorce, I told her. He hasn't engaged a lawyer yet, as far as I know. Then wait, she said. And while you wait, document everything. I drove home that afternoon with something new beginning to settle into my chest. Not comfort exactly, but the preliminary framework of it. I had a path. I had a professional in my corner. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had taken a shape I could work with. That evening, Derek's mother called him. I heard her voice through the door of the guest room. Patricia Calloway, 63 years old, a woman who had never fully accepted that her son had married a woman with professional ambitions. She'd always treated me like a tolerated guest at her own son's table. I pressed nothing. I simply noted that she knew. Derek had told her quickly. That was information. I opened a new notebook, paper, not digital, because I'd learned long ago that paper was harder to access without your knowledge than a phone, and I began to write. First, I listed every joint asset: the house, one car registered in both names, a savings account. Then I listed what I knew to be separately mine: the business entity, the business accounts, my grandmother's original investment. Then I started a third list. This one was different. It was the list of things Derek believed about me that were not true. He believed I earned $4,500 a month. He believed my consulting work was small and casual. He believed he was the financially dominant partner in this marriage. He believed I had no options without him. Every item on that list was a misperception he had chosen to maintain because it suited him. I hadn't lied to him. I simply hadn't corrected the story he preferred to tell about us. Now I was going to stop arranging my life around his comfort. The plan forming in my mind was not dramatic. There was no revenge fantasy at its center. I wasn't interested in humiliation for its own sake. I was interested in fairness. I was interested in protecting what I had built. And I was interested quietly and precisely in making sure that Derek's departure from my life cost him nothing that wasn't his, and gave him nothing that was mine. I wrote until past midnight. When I finally closed the notebook, I felt something settle in my spine, a kind of upright stillness. Tomorrow, I would start making calls. The first call I made was to my accountant, James Whitfield. James had managed my business finances for 4 years. He knew the full picture: revenue, retained earnings, expense structure, growth trajectory. I met him at his office in Oak Park on a Thursday morning, told him I was beginning divorce proceedings, and asked him to prepare a comprehensive valuation of the business as of the date of incorporation and as of today. He adjusted his glasses. You want the delta clearly documented. Exactly, I said. I want it clear what existed before the marriage contributed anything and what grew independently. He nodded. I'll have a preliminary analysis in 10 days. Next, I called my business attorney, Roland Park, and asked him to review my corporate documents. He confirmed what I'd hoped. The LLC was structured in my name alone, with documentation showing the initial capital transfer from my grandmother's estate. The paper trail was clean. Roland was cautious by nature, but even he admitted it was a strong position. Then I did something smaller but equally important. I began to quietly restructure my personal finances. I had been drawing a modest salary from the business into the joint account, $4,500 a month. I did not stop this immediately because stopping it suddenly would look suspicious if Derek was already speaking to a lawyer. Instead, I consulted Margaret, and we agreed I would give 30 days' notice of my intention to adjust the joint account contributions, which was reasonable and legal. I was not hiding money. I was preparing to separate what was already mine. During all of this, Derek said very little to me at home. He had adopted a kind of aloof distance, as though the divorce were already final and he was simply waiting for the paperwork. His mother called more frequently. I could hear their conversations in fragments, Patricia's voice carrying a particular authority even through closed doors. One evening, I passed the hallway just as Derek ended a call. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not contempt, not the familiar condescension, but something more cautious, watchful. "You seem busy," he said. "I am," I said, and walked past him. He didn't ask with what. That was interesting. Margaret had advised me to behave normally to keep my routine, and I did. I went to my office every morning. I kept client calls. I attended a Chamber of Commerce networking event and shook hands and exchanged cards as though my personal life were entirely uneventful. But beneath the surface, the architecture of what I was building was taking shape, beam by beam. The revelation came on a Tuesday. I had arranged, through a friend who worked in HR at Derek's company, to confirm something I had long suspected. I hadn't asked her to breach any confidentiality. I simply asked, casually, over lunch, how things were going at Meridian Solutions. She mentioned with the offhand candor of someone who didn't realize she was confirming anything significant that the restructuring was still ongoing, that several senior managers had taken voluntary severance packages, and that Derek's division had been absorbed into another department. "I think a few people are on performance review," she said, reaching for her water glass. I kept my face neutral. Derek had not told me any of this. He was going home every day, or appearing to. He had not mentioned that his position was under review. He was presenting himself as the stable, dominant earner in our household, while standing on ground that was quietly shifting beneath him. That evening, I checked the joint savings account online. 3 weeks earlier, we'd had $42,000 in it. That evening, the balance was $26,000. $16,000 had been withdrawn, in cash, over the previous 9 days. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the number on the screen for a very long time. This was not an oversight. This was not a large purchase I'd forgotten. This was deliberate. Derek, or Derek with someone advising him, was beginning to move money before the divorce was even formally filed. I photographed the screen with my phone. Then I opened a new email draft to Margaret. "I need to meet tomorrow morning," I wrote. "We have a documentation problem that's become a documentation opportunity." I hit send and closed my laptop. This was the moment the situation changed. Until now, I had been preparing defensively. I had been protecting what was mine, organizing documents, consulting professionals. I had been careful and measured. But Derek had just handed me something I hadn't asked for, proof that he was acting in bad faith before the divorce was even filed. $16,000 moved quietly, without discussion, during a period when he'd announced his intention to separate. In the state of Illinois, that kind of asset dissipation during divorce proceedings was not simply frowned upon. It was the sort of thing courts noticed. The ground, I realized, had shifted, but not beneath me. Margaret moved quickly once she saw the account documentation. She filed a formal petition for dissolution of marriage on my behalf, which, under Illinois law, required financial disclosures from both parties. The moment that petition was filed, Derek's ability to quietly move marital assets became legally precarious. Any further dissipation would need to be accounted for. Margaret simultaneously filed a motion for a financial status quo order, an injunction requiring both parties to maintain the current financial status of all marital accounts pending the proceedings. The court granted a temporary version of it within 72 hours. I remember the afternoon Margaret called to tell me. I was in my office reviewing a contract proposal from a client in Atlanta. I set the proposal aside, made a note in my notebook, and returned to the proposal. This was the rhythm I was learning. Crisis and continuity, running in parallel. Derek was served the following Monday. I was not home when it happened. Margaret had advised me to be elsewhere, and I spent the morning at a coffee shop in downtown Naperville with my laptop working. My phone rang at 11:43. An unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from Patricia. Her voice was controlled but threaded with a particular tightness. The sound of someone who had prepared her words but was using effort to deliver them calmly. "Claire, this is Patricia. I think it's time we had a conversation, the three of us. You're making this very complicated, and I think there are things being said by lawyers that don't represent what Derek actually wants. Please call me back." I played it twice. Then I forwarded it to Margaret with a single line. "Derek's mother is attempting to contact me directly, advising me to bypass legal representation." Margaret's response came in 4 minutes. "Do not engage. Do not return that call." I didn't. 2 days later, Patricia showed up at the house. I was home. The doorbell rang at 2 in the afternoon, and when I looked through the window, I saw her standing on my porch in a camel coat, holding her handbag with both hands. She had brought Derek. He stood slightly behind her, looking at the yard rather than the door. I opened it. "We'd like to come in," Patricia said. I considered this for a moment. Then I stepped aside. We sat in the living room. Biscuit retreated to the hallway. Patricia placed her handbag carefully on the cushion beside her and looked at me with an expression that was designed to look gentle but contained, underneath it, something much more like calculation. "Claire, you are taking this to a place it doesn't need to go," she said. "Derek made a mistake taking some money. He was scared. That's not a crime." "His attorney is already aware of it," I said. "You're trying to destroy him," she said. The gentleness slipped. "I'm trying to fairly dissolve a marriage," I said. Derek spoke then. "You filed against me, after I said I wanted the divorce." "You took $16,000 from a joint account," I said. "My attorney advised me to file before more disappeared." "That money was mine, too." "It was marital money," I said, "and you moved it without disclosure or agreement during active separation." Patricia's voice dropped to something flatter. "You should be careful, Claire. You are not in as strong a position as you think you are. Derek knows people. This town is small. Businesses depend on relationships, and relationships depend on reputation. It would be a shame if your client started hearing things." There it was. I let the silence run for 3 full seconds. "Patricia," I said, "that is called tortious interference with business relations. It's also potentially defamation. My attorney would find it very useful." She blinked. I stood up. "I think we're done here. Please have any further communication directed through legal channels." They left. Patricia with her jaw tight. Derek without looking at me once. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. But something was moving beneath that calm. Not fear exactly, but the awareness of how much was now in motion and how much it would take to see it through. I texted Margaret a summary. Then I booked a long weekend at a small inn in Wisconsin. 3 nights, a room overlooking a lake, no obligations. I needed 48 hours of distance from the architecture I was building. Not to abandon it, but to make sure I came back to it whole. You cannot construct something solid from exhausted materials. I drove north on a Friday afternoon with Biscuit in the back seat, and I let myself, for the first time in weeks, simply breathe. The inn was a converted farmhouse on the western edge of Lake Geneva, the kind of place that predated the boutique hotel trend by 40 years and was better for it. My room had wide plank floors and a window seat deep enough to sit in, and the breakfast served downstairs was made by a woman named Dolores, who had apparently been cooking at that inn since 1987. I slept 9 hours the first night. I hadn't slept 9 consecutive hours in months. By the second morning, something had reset. I sat in the window seat with coffee and watched the lake surface shift with the wind, and I understood that what I'd been carrying was not just the weight of the divorce proceedings, but 11 years of quietly adjusting myself to fit a shape Derek needed me to be. Smaller, less visible, financially modest, gratefully dependent. That shape was no longer mine to maintain. On the second afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message read, "Claire, it's Derek. I know I shouldn't text directly. I just want to say, I may have handled things badly. I'd like to talk, without lawyers. Just us. Is that something you'd be open to?" I read it once, then a second time. I had known this was possible. Margaret had actually predicted it. Not Derek specifically, but the general tactic. When the legal position of one party strengthens, the other often attempts an emotional bypass, a direct appeal to intimacy or shared history designed to create a moment of softening outside the formal structure where careful concessions might be extracted. Derek was not a strategist by nature, but he had Patricia, and Patricia was. I typed back 2 sentences. "Please communicate through your attorney. Mine is available." I sent it, then forwarded the screenshot to Margaret. She replied, "Perfect. Save all direct contact attempts." I put my phone in the nightstand drawer and went for a walk along the water with Biscuit. When I returned to Naperville on Monday, I was steadier than I'd been in months. The lake had done what lakes reliably do, reduce things to a more honest scale. I called my sister Dana that week. Dana lived in Portland, and we had always been close in that specific way that sisters can be close, deeply familiar and occasionally blunt to the point of bruising. I hadn't told her much about the situation because I hadn't wanted to be talked out of anything, and Dana had opinions. But I needed her now, not for strategy, but for the simpler human requirement of being known. I told her everything: the business, the money, Derek's announcement, the 16,000, Patricia on the porch, the Wisconsin weekend. She was quiet for a moment when I finished. "Claire," she said, "how long did you know the marriage was wrong?" I thought about it honestly. 3 years, I said, maybe 4. "And you stayed." I stayed. "Okay," she said. "We're done analyzing that. What do you need?" That was Dana. No performance of sympathy, no extended autopsy of my choices. Just the functional question. I told her I needed someone to know, someone who wasn't an attorney or an accountant or a professional whose relationship with me was bounded by a retainer. She flew in the following Thursday. We spent the weekend doing ordinary things, eating at a restaurant I liked in the West Loop, driving out to the Morton Arboretum, cooking dinner badly and laughing about it. Dana slept in the guest room that Derek had vacated, and the house felt different with her in it, less like a contested territory, more like mine. On Saturday morning, she watched me answer a work email at the kitchen table. "You know," she said, refilling her coffee, "most people would be falling apart right now." I thought about it, I said. It seemed expensive. She laughed, loud and genuine, and for a moment something unknotted in my chest. I also reached out to two women I'd known professionally for years. Renata, who ran a PR firm in Chicago, and Josephine, a former client who'd become a friend. Both had been through divorces. Neither had been through divorces quite like mine, the financial asymmetry, the deliberate concealment. But they understood the basic physics of it, the way a marriage's ending can make you feel like the sum total of someone else's disappointment. We met for dinner at a restaurant in Wicker Park. I didn't tell them everything. I was careful about what remained in confidence, but I told them enough. Renata put her wine glass down and said, "You are going to be absolutely fine, and the fact that you know that is why you're going to be fine." Josephine just raised her glass. I went home that night and slept without the nightstand notebook for the first time in weeks. It was a Tuesday evening in early October when they came again. I had just finished a client call, a Chicago-based retailer reviewing a 6-month strategy engagement. I'd closed the call, made my notes, and was making tea when I heard a car in the driveway, 2 doors closing. I looked through the front window. Derek and Patricia, together, again. Derek was carrying what appeared to be a bottle of wine. I stood in my kitchen for a moment and made a decision. My attorney's standing instruction was to redirect all contact, but they were not attempting legal contact. They were at my door, which I had every right to manage on my terms. I could document the encounter, and there was something I wanted to observe. I let them in. Patricia had shifted her presentation since the last visit. The calculation was still there, but it was dressed differently now, softer, almost apologetic. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and set the wine aside, as if it had been a social offering and not a prop. "We came to apologize," she said. "What I said last time, about your business, about clients. I was out of line. I was upset." I waited. "Derek and I have been talking," she continued, "a lot. And we think, that this situation has gotten out of hand, that it didn't need to go to lawyers, that you and Derek had something real, and real things deserve a second chance." I looked at Derek. He was studying the table. "Is that what you think?" I asked him directly. He looked up. His expression was complicated. There was something genuine in it, or what was trying to pass for genuine. "I think I said things that were wrong. The burden comment. I was angry and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair." "No," I said, "it wasn't." "I'm asking you to think about whether we can talk, really talk, before this goes further," he said. "There's still time to step back from the legal process. If we both agreed—" "Derek," I said, "you moved $16,000 from our joint account without telling me. My attorney has that documented." "That was a mistake," Patricia said smoothly. "Derek panicked. He can put it back. That shouldn't define everything." "I agree it shouldn't define everything," I said. "But the court is already aware of it. That's not something that gets put back like money in a drawer." Patricia's expression shifted. The softness recalibrated. "Claire," she said, and her voice took on a different texture now, still controlled, but stripped of the warmth she'd been performing. "I want to be honest with you. If you push this, Derek is going to push back. He has documentation of things, too. Your separate accounts, the money you kept from him. A court could look at that and call it financial concealment. You could find yourself looking very different in front of a judge than you do right now." There it was, the same move as last time, refined. I set my mug down slowly and looked at Patricia with the same measured attention I gave to contracts I was about to decline. I had learned over years of professional negotiation that the moment someone reaches for a threat, they have already exhausted their more legitimate tools. A threat is not strength. It is the announcement of its absence. Patricia believed she was applying pressure. What she was actually doing was showing me exactly how little she had left. Patricia, the accounts you're referring to were established before our marriage and have been maintained as my separate business accounts with full legal documentation. My attorney is not concerned. If Derek's attorney wishes to argue that point, they are welcome to do so. You're very confident, she said. I am, I said. You're welcome to leave now. Derek stood first. He looked at me for a long moment. Not with contempt this time, but with something more complicated. Something that looked, if I was reading it correctly, like the beginning of a reckoning. Like a man who was slowly understanding the shape of what he'd miscalculated. Patricia gathered herself with practiced composure. But for the first time since the proceedings had begun, that composure had a visible seam. She was a woman who had built her influence on being the smartest person in the room, the one who anticipated, maneuvered, and concluded. Tonight she had come with a script and left without having used it. I could see her recalibrating in real time, filing away this version of me for future reference, as though I had surprised her by being something she hadn't fully accounted for. "You're making a mistake," she said at the door. "I've considered that," I said. "Good night." I closed the door, and then I stood in my hallway and let myself feel, for exactly 60 seconds, the fear, because it was there. Patricia's threat about financial concealment was not entirely without teeth, even if my position was strong. Courts were unpredictable. People were unpredictable. I was not operating in a vacuum of perfect certainty. I let the fear exist. I breathed through it, and then I felt something else move in alongside it, something harder and quieter. The fear was real, but so was everything I'd built. Every documented account, every business record, every conversation forwarded to Margaret. I had been careful. I had been thorough. I had been, for the first time in this marriage, operating entirely as myself. The fear didn't go away, but it became fuel. I went upstairs and opened my notebook. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November. Margaret had been preparing me for 3 weeks. We had run through the likely questions, the probable framing, the specific ways Derek's attorney, a man named Garrett Sloan, would attempt to characterize my financial situation as either concealment or marital misconduct. Sloan was competent and aggressive in the particular way of attorneys who represent clients with weak factual positions. He would try to win on tone rather than substance. I dressed carefully that morning. A dark blazer, a cream blouse, shoes I could walk confidently in. I arrived at the conference room on Michigan Avenue 12 minutes early and was already seated, water glass in front of me, when Derek and Sloan entered. Derek looked tired. He'd lost some weight, and not in a way that suggested health. He sat across from me and did not meet my eyes. Patricia was not present. Depositions weren't social events, and Sloan had enough sense to keep her out of it. But I knew she'd coached Derek the night before. I knew the shape of the arguments they were planning to run. Sloan opened with financial history, standard territory. How long had I been in business? What was the gross revenue last year? Had I ever deposited business funds into the marital account? My answers were precise, brief, and documented. I did not elaborate beyond what was asked. I did not fill silence with nervous qualifications. Margaret had taught me that much, There is a discipline to brevity under pressure, a practiced resistance to the instinct to explain yourself, to soften, to preemptively manage how you are being perceived. I had spent 11 years reflexively making myself easier to understand. In that conference room, I stopped. Then Sloan shifted. "Ms. Hendricks, would you characterize the decision to maintain separate accounts throughout your marriage as a deliberate choice?" "Yes," I said. "And you made this choice without informing your husband?" "The accounts were established before the marriage. Derek was aware I had independent accounts. He was not given monthly statements because he never asked for them." "But you didn't volunteer the information about your income." "I wasn't asked about my income," I said. "Derek had full access to any financial conversation he wished to have. He preferred not to examine my finances closely." "Why do you think that was?" Sloan asked. I looked at him steadily. "Because he assumed they weren't significant." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Sloan, if we're going to discuss the voluntary financial communication patterns in this marriage, I believe we have documentation you'll want to review." She opened a folder. What came next was what I had been building toward for 4 months. James Whitfield's analysis showed, clearly and in documented form, that the business's entire capitalization derived from my premarital inheritance, and that the retained earnings had been reinvested into the business rather than into marital funds, a fact that substantially undermined any argument of marital contribution. The corporate documents showed continuous, unbroken single ownership with no spousal involvement. And then Margaret produced the second set of documents. These were bank records, Derek's personal account, which had been subject to discovery. They showed not one transfer of marital funds, but 3. The initial $16,000 and 2 subsequent transfers, smaller, that had gone into an account opened 4 months before Derek announced the divorce. An account Margaret had traced through discovery to a prepaid card system. Derek's attorney hadn't known about the 3rd transfer. I watched Derek's face as Sloan registered what he was looking at. Derek had gone still in the particular way of someone whose internal calculations are running too fast to maintain an outward expression. His hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, had closed into something closer to fists. He was, I understood in that moment, not a bad man in the dramatic sense, not calculated or cold-blooded. He was something more ordinary and in some ways sadder. A man who had made a sequence of choices driven by fear and pride, and had told himself each time that the next move would correct the last one. Now the sequence was complete, and the correction was not coming. "Mr. Calloway," Margaret said, her voice entirely level, "when did you open the Bancorp account ending in 7741? Derek looked at Sloan. Sloan put a hand briefly on Derek's arm. "Don't answer yet." But the hesitation itself was its own answer. "The documentation shows a date of February 14th, Margaret said pleasantly. "That's 8 months before you told your wife you wanted a divorce, and 4 months before your division at Meridian Solutions was formally placed under performance review." Derek's composure had been eroding for 20 minutes, but this was the moment it broke. Not dramatically. There was no outburst. His face simply went through several expressions in rapid succession: calculation, fear, and then something almost like relief, which is the particular expression of people who are exhausted by a secret and have finally been relieved of the obligation to maintain it. Sloan requested a recess, his voice professionally even, but I noticed he did not look at his client when he said it. An attorney who cannot make eye contact with his own client in a recess request is an attorney who has just understood the full dimensions of what he was not told going in. That gap, between what Derek had disclosed to Sloan and what the documents now showed was visible in the set of Sloan's shoulders as he stood. "Of course," Margaret said. We recessed. In the hallway, Margaret touched my arm once, a small, deliberate gesture, and said nothing. She didn't need to. When we returned to the table, Sloan proposed within 11 minutes beginning settlement discussions. Settlement discussions lasted 6 weeks. This was faster than average for a contested Illinois divorce with complex financial circumstances, and the reason it moved quickly was simple. Derek's position had fundamentally collapsed at the deposition. The pre-opened account, the documented fund transfers beginning 8 months before the announced separation, the absence of any documentable contribution to my business, all of it created a factual landscape that left Garrett Sloan with very little to work with. He was a professional. He made the calculation and advised his client accordingly. The first offer Derek's side proposed was almost insulting in its ambition. Half the value of my business, a 50-50 split on the house equity, and a monthly maintenance payment. Margaret walked me through it with an expression that suggested she'd seen worse and wasn't worried. "This is their opening position," she said. "Their actual position is considerably more modest. They know it." We countered. The negotiation moved in documented professional increments across 6 weeks. I was not present for most of the back and forth between the attorneys. Margaret handled it, with my approval on each significant decision. But I read every email, reviewed every proposed term, and sat with each decision carefully before signing off. I had not come this far to be careless in the final mile. Each term sheet that arrived I read twice, once for what it said, and once for what it was carefully not saying. The gap between those two readings was usually where the real negotiation lived. There was one moment in the 4th week when Derek's side floated the possibility of mediation, a softer framing, a suggestion that the two of us sit in a room with a neutral third party and find our way to something mutually agreeable. Margaret presented it to me without editorial comment, which was her way of letting me make the call without her preference on the table. I thought about it for less than a day. Mediation operates on the assumption that both parties have acted in reasonable good faith and need a structured conversation to find middle ground. Derek had opened a hidden account 8 months before announcing the divorce. There was no middle ground that accounting for. There was only a correct accounting of it. I declined, politely and finally. What the final settlement looked like was this. The house would be sold. We had approximately $212,000 in equity. We split it, $106,000 each. That was fair. That was the portion of the marriage we had built together, and I had no interest in being unfair. The joint savings account, what remained of it after Derek's transfers, was divided equally after the transferred amounts were credited back to my share. Derek repaid $31,000 in dissipated marital funds as part of the settlement, which was non-negotiable and which Sloan had stopped trying to negotiate around. My business was ruled entirely separate property. The court agreed that the initial capitalization from my grandmother's estate established it as separate, and that Derek's absence from any business activity or financial contribution eliminated his claim to the retained earnings. He received nothing from the business, not $1. Derek also did not receive spousal maintenance. He was employed, or re-employed as it turned out, having survived the Meridian reorganization in a reduced capacity, and his need argument couldn't survive scrutiny. The morning the settlement was finalized, I sat in Margaret's office and signed my name 11 times. Margaret notarized the documents and sent copies to the court. She shook my hand, which she'd never done before, and I understood that to mean something. I walked out onto Michigan Avenue and stood on the sidewalk in November light. The city moved around me with its ordinary indifference. Taxis, pedestrians, a food cart releasing steam into the cold air. And I stood in the middle of it feeling, for a long moment, neither victorious nor diminished. Just present, just precisely, accurately myself, in a life that was now, without qualification, mine. Patricia Calloway called me that afternoon. I watched her name appear on my screen and felt nothing in particular. I let it ring. The voicemail she left was unlike the others, shorter and stripped of its previous architecture of suggestion and threat. She said only, "I hope you're satisfied." I thought about that for a moment. Satisfaction wasn't quite the word. Satisfaction implies surprise, implies that the outcome exceeded expectations. What I felt was more like the closing of a ledger, every column adding up to what it should, the final total reflecting the actual numbers rather than the numbers someone had preferred, I believe. In late January, approximately 6 weeks after the settlement was finalized, I received an email. It came through the careers page of my company's website, which meant it had passed through my office manager before reaching me with a note. "Applicant seems overqualified. Wanted to flag." I opened the application. Derek Michael Calloway. A cover letter explaining that he had experience in sales management and regional operations and was exploring new professional opportunities following a corporate restructuring. He was applying for a business development director position my company had posted. I read it twice. I forwarded it to my HR manager, Teresa, with 3 words: standard process, declined. Teresa was experienced enough not to ask why. The rejection letter went out with the next batch. Professional, impersonal, thanking him for his interest and wishing him well in his search. I don't know if he knew it was my company when he applied. I don't know whether Patricia had somehow missed connecting the name on the building to my name. I don't know whether it was desperation, ignorance, or something closer to audacity. What I know is that the answer was no. Clean, documented, final. I closed his file and returned to the Atlanta contract I'd been reviewing. Spring came to Chicago with the particular vigor of a city that has genuinely suffered winter and intends to make the most of its reprieve. I moved into a condominium in Lincoln Park in early March, a 2-bedroom unit on the 4th floor with windows that caught the afternoon light and a kitchen large enough to actually use. Biscuit approved immediately, conducting a thorough inspection of every room before settling on a spot near the balcony door as his designated territory. The first morning I woke up in that apartment with no one else's rhythms to navigate, no careful calibrations of what to say or how much to reveal. I lay in bed and noticed something I hadn't felt in years. The uncomplicated ease of being alone and not minding it. More than not minding, actually welcoming it. The quiet was mine. Every decision in that space was mine. The thermostat, the grocery list, the morning playlist, the way I arranged the books on the shelf. Small things, but they accumulated into something that felt like oxygen. My business continued to grow. Without the low-grade, persistent stress of managing a marriage around concealment, I found I had more mental bandwidth than I'd realized I'd been spending. By April, I had brought on 2 new clients, one in Cincinnati, one in Minneapolis, and was negotiating a partnership arrangement with a firm in Denver that would, if it closed, roughly double my consulting capacity. James Whitfield updated my projections in May and used the word conservative to describe what he was putting in the optimistic column. I hired a 4th full-time employee. I redesigned the company website. Sleek, professional, my name clearly on it. No more modest profile, no more strategic invisibility. The company was Claire Hendricks Consulting, and Claire Hendricks was done arranging herself into a smaller shape. Dana visited again in June, and we sat on the balcony in the evenings and drank wine and talked about things that had nothing to do with divorce, her kids, a trip she was planning to Portugal, a book we'd both been circling. The ease of it was remarkable, the specific ease of a friendship that has survived you at your worst and doesn't require anything other than your honest company. Renata introduced me at a fundraiser in July to a man named Patrick, an architect who specialized in adaptive reuse projects and had strong opinions about the Chicago lakefront and no opinions at all about what I should earn or how visibly I should succeed. We had dinner the following week and another the week after. I was not in a hurry, neither was he. It was, I thought, exactly the right pace for people who had learned something from their previous velocities. As for Derek and Patricia, I heard things because Chicago's professional community is smaller than it appears. Derek's position at Meridian was eliminated entirely in August as part of a second round of restructuring. He had not found comparable employment by the end of the year. I was told, by a mutual acquaintance who had no reason to shade the information, that he'd taken a part-time role with a smaller company in Indiana, commuting. That his LinkedIn had been updated twice, each time with slightly less impressive language. My company's application rejection had apparently been one of several. Derek was discovering, in the way that people often do once the scaffolding of a particular life collapses, that the competencies he'd assumed were general were actually more situational than he'd known. Patricia, I heard through a different channel, had suffered a significant financial loss when an investment property she owned in Schaumburg went through a difficult sale. Market timing, structural issues, prolonged vacancy. She had taken it hard. She was, by the accounts available to me, not doing well. I did not feel vindictive about this. I want to be honest about that. What had been done to me was real, and its undoing had required real effort and real cost, but I took no pleasure in their difficulties. Their lives contracting was not a victory I'd engineered. I hadn't engineered it at all. It was simply the ordinary consequence of choices they had made over a long time, compounding. What I felt, when the information reached me, was something closer to clarity, a sense that outcomes over time tend to reflect reality, that the version of the world Derek had constructed in his head, where he was the capable one, the stable one, the earner whose departure would destabilize me, had proven to be a story he'd told himself, not a fact. And stories eventually encounter the world. I was, at 39 years old, more financially stable than I'd ever been, in a home I'd chosen, building something that was unambiguously mine. One Thursday evening in September, I sat at my desk after a long but productive day, opened my notebook, a new one, the old one long since finished, and wrote a single line at the top of a blank page. Start where you actually are. I looked at it for a moment. Then I went to make dinner.